All right, so just saying that one more time, just for the recording that you all will have, is the diagram it generates instant feedback within students, which is a very powerful um, experience for them that then helps them better calibrate their learning and be able to successfully navigate their way to deep thinking and learning independently. So we went through how the diagram works. I'm going to skip through these. And so the assignment that I gave you all yesterday was the outcome variation. And this idea of outcome variation is the most important skill I believe that students can have. I've never seen it articulated in the literature, but I hear it reflected in educators' comments frequently. And it's reflected by them just mainly talking about students' memorization and them not getting enough depth. And so when I talk to students about this idea, what I realize from students is that they have no conceptualization of varying outcomes. And I'm known for saying this quote that students are excuse me, students are very adept at reaching the same outcomes with different content. So they're very good at reaching the same outcomes with different content. What they're not so good at is reaching different outcomes with the same content. So, and that's what we worked on, the outcome variation. How do you take a topic, a theme, an idea, a principle, and how do you dig deeper on that and get deeper outcomes as opposed to just getting what are essentially factoids about that. So this particular document that's on the screen, somebody let me know, are you all seeing an outcome variation activity sheet on your screen? Okay, great. Just want to make sure. So, and also, so this document covers the three components of metacognition, which at the bottom of your screen, at the bottom of this document, you'll see they are planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Those three things are very, very important, and so we're going to talk about how those three things are used. So, if you look at here, this was created by a high school teacher actually that I was working with, and she put this helped me put this all together. And so she's a biology professor, and as you can see at the top of your screen, it's some of the content that she's was going over with her students at the time that I visited her class. And so she listed, and she gives these to her students. I'll show you how this looks in a broader way in a minute after I explain this. But she goes over the various topics here at the top of what they're going to be covering, and then over to the right of that, she adds the resources. Again, moving them toward independent learning. She tells them use your lecture handouts, reading guides, and online resources to gain an understanding of this material. Then what students do, as you can see this level, we have the content level over here at the top. Down we have the think well, learn well interaction level, and that's directly from the think well, learn well diagram from the most top row, which is remembering. And then down here at the bottom, it says student directed plan for success. So this is where students, sometimes in conjunction with a teacher or a faculty member or a tutor or by themselves, they develop their plan of action so that now they're self-directing their learning, which which in education in general is a big, big, important step. So here it says on the first level, it says planning. What are you attempting to do with the information you're studying? So again, this is the metacognitive learning goal. And for remembering, they're going to have to spell out, again, making that metacognitive process that is oftentimes unknown to them, making that known, making it explicit, making them aware of it, and thus moving them toward metacognitive control. Excuse me. So what are you attempting to do with this information? The student will write in what they're attempting to do. So it might be, again, if we're talking about the history of cell theory, okay, I want to know what the history of cell theory is right here. Then in the middle column, it says monitoring. Okay, what level of thinking What level are you thinking on while studying? So this is where the student simply reports back, checks in here, and says, okay, I can tell that I'm thinking on a remembering level, and here's how I know I'm thinking on a remembering level. Then over here, the final column says evaluation. What can you do with what you now know? So again, this is what research says is the most important distinction, one of the most important distinctions between successful students and struggling students is the ability to accurately evaluate your knowledge, or what the research calls judgments of knowledge. So now students who, once they get over here, they're simply reflecting back on the process of their monitoring, their interaction. What do I know now? What can I do about the history of cell theory? And for this level remembering, they'll be able to maybe describe the history of cell theory. What were the important components of the history of cell theory, so on and so forth. Does that make sense to you? I see some yeses. So do you all see this larger version of this on your screen now that I'm scrolling up and down with? Okay, great. So this is the same thing. It's just without the text, the biology text on there. And I'm actually going to put this online. I just got these ordered because I've seen this so useful with educators. So if you look on my resources page in the next, probably by next week, you can actually order these from the resources page. But as you can see here in the middle, it has the basic. This is the basic remembering level, and if you keep going down here, it has this is the understanding level. This scrolling isn't working here, unfortunately. Sorry about that. So immediately following that is the understanding level. And as you can see, the blue color gets a little bit darker. Then I can scroll down a little bit more. We have the applying level, and the blue gets a little bit darker. Then we have the analyzing level, and it gets a little bit darker, so on and so forth. So this particular document, it comes with 20 of these particular packets. So 6 levels, 20 of them, and at the top of it, it has one of the Think Well, Learn Well diagrams. So you can use it in a class with tutors or however you want, and they can actually walk students through how to use this particular tool to drive student learning. Again, I think I've seen it used by some educators so far, but I'm just introducing it more broadly soon here in the next coming weeks. And I think it's going to be a very, very effective tool for educators to help improve student learning and improve student performance. So now we're back to the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to move us ahead here. So talked about the assignment. I'm not going to go back to that. I'm going to move us ahead of that. So, okay, so now that students understand the Think Well, Learn Well diagram, perhaps you have used the outcome variation activity sheet to help them hone in and to actually go through the process of deliberately setting metacognitive learning goals, planning it, monitoring it, and evaluating it. And again, this isn't done constantly. It's something that if you do this work in the beginning, then what happens is students develop this framework and then they no longer need it. It becomes internalized. And the next thing I like to talk about is outcome valuation. And this is more of a reinforcement mechanism, both a motivation and a reinforcement mechanism. So now that students are using the diagram, how do we reinforce this? How do we make this more useful and meaningful to them? So valuation is a term from finance that actually means the process of determining what something is worth. And we do this all the time, rather subconsciously. When we go to a store, they have a price list of something, and then we If we believe that price is fair, we pay for it. We go out, take out our money or our card, and we purchase it. And that's essentially a transaction in which we are affirming the valuation of that item. We are saying to the people who created that how you price this. I agree with how you price this. And the closer the valuation is, on both sides, the easier the transaction will be. You know, if you go to a store and you believe something's overpriced, well, then you have a different valuation or sense of worth of that thing than what the actual makers of that or sellers of that has. In the same way, students go through this process constantly with their educators. Teachers, professors hand back assignments, papers, or tests, and they're essentially giving students a valuation, determining what their work is worth. And students often have a different interpretation of what their work is worth. And the closer we can align those two, the better students are going to be, and the less frustrated faculty members or educators are going to be. And so here's a little way that you can help reinforce that. So I have these created these dollar bills, and a way that you can communicate this to students is each level has a certain value associated with it. The shallowest level is $5, meaning that it does have value. If you memorize your way through stuff, there is some value. You know something, but it's not as valuable as understanding, which is worth 10, applying, which is worth 20, analyzing, which is worth 50, evaluating, which is worth 100, creating, which is worth 500. Now, here's the kicker. Students must understand that you can choose to work at $5 for your work, $5 an hour, so to speak. But wouldn't it be much more valuable and a much more a better use of your time if you can work down here for $50 or $100 or $500 for your hour, for your work? And so this is a way that students you can reinforce and even motivate students to understand the value of their work. In fact, if you work with adult learners, those of you who work with adult learners, I've seen this very powerfully used with adult learners, because adult learners understand to some degree, at least they're more serious about school. And if we can help adult learners understand that these different cognitive functions aren't just for school down here, but they also matter in your employment, because typically higher paying jobs, aside from riskier jobs, but typically higher paying jobs are paying people to operate down here at this critical thinking level of analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So anyway, that's kind of a different subject that I don't want to go too far in, but that's a way that learning can be reinforced. Now I want to get to this learning sufficiency diagram. So if you have that diagram, you might want to pull that out. So I want to get to this quickly. So the think well, learn well diagram is an efficient knowledge converter. Take students from different levels of knowing to helping them go from just the goal of that learning of that particular topic they're trying to learn, and all the way to the actual outcomes and assessing their outcomes. The learning sufficiency diagram sort of picks up from that, and it's focused on transitioning students to different levels. So for students, how do I know that in real time, that I've moved from understanding to applying in my interaction? How do I know that? And so that's why I created this diagram. So I'll briefly go over some of these, and then if we have time, if there's questions, I'll go back and revisit this. But I think you'll get the gist of it since you get the think well, learn well diagram. So on the remembering levels, and this is where most students start, says level of thinking, which is all listed here in the first column. Next to that, the next column says learning outcome or product. So this is the actual outcome that they have. Students are able to accurately define and recall basic terms, ideas, principles, and concepts. Students are able to mentally match stored information with the exam questions that have embedded cues. So you may recall that this column here is very similar to the final or third column in the think well, learn well diagram. Okay? So if you're with me, just type in yes or no so I can make sure. Great. Great. Okay. Thank you. So this next column is something that I haven't introduced yet, which is very, very important. And this is the learning metrics. So all students gauge their learning. If you think back to anything you've learned, what happens is there's this point along the way that we begin to gauge ourselves and say, okay, how well do I know this? How well do I know this thing? And so this particular column is to convey that to students. So this first one says sufficiency of learning, which means when I believe I've, adequately learned the material is gauged by the correctness and accuracy of information learned. So in this remembering level, as I mentioned yesterday, students are gauging their learning by how correct am I in what I'm trying to remember and how accurate is what I'm trying to remember. Meaning, am I remembering the right things correct? And are the things that I'm remembering actually, am I remembering them correctly? So that's what those two things mean. And then the next one for their metric says quality of information learned is indicative of successful study session. So again, quantity of information learned is indicative of successful study sessions. So again, we talked about this. Students don't do well on the test. They go back and they say, oh, I need to study harder or more, which means they just increase the quantity of stuff they've memorized. So that's at that level. And then the confirmation, meaning that I call it the sense of I got itness, that in their mind when they believe, okay, I know this, I'm ready to move on. It says this is when students deem that they have gathered the correct information, that they can accurately recall it, and that they can do so with a sufficient quantity of items when they know the what's. So what this is saying that students they believe they've got the correct information, that they're accurate, and that they know enough. They have enough things that they've stored in their memory. So we get that one. So transition zones. So this one has all these transition zones I put in to help students be able to understand when they've transitioned. So the first transition zone says when students move beyond only being able to describe, classify, list, and or recall information to explaining, expounding, and connecting this information to key principles, concepts, theories. In essence, the learner moves from only asking what is the correct information to asking why is the information relevant. So again, when students find themselves and we help students see that process of transition, we can point out to them and give them instant feedback that you see now you've moved to a different level. Now you're asking different questions. And many of you probably are aware that you may have said this to your students before. Difficult courses, professors care more about, or teachers care more about the questions you ask than the answers you provide, because the questions reveal your thinking, whereas the answers just show what you remembered. Answers are important, but questions are far more valuable. So let me skip down just for the sake of time. You'll have this on the screen and you have this document to go back to. We're going to skip down to analyzing since that's the one that many students struggle on. So students are able to distinguish between seemingly similar sets of information. Students are able to differentiate between levels of significance. Now, we already get that because that's similar to the third column of the Think Well, Learn Well diagram. So let's go over to this new area, the learning metric. Again, the gauge, how students are gauging it. Sufficient learning has been achieved if all relevant factors have been considered. So this is an entirely different metric. It's not measuring accuracy now or well, it is a quantitative component to it, but it's measuring now if all of the relevant factors have been considered. So this is a different weight here. And then finally, the confirmation is when students sense that they have accounted for all the factors that should be considered, when students sense that they have recognized all applicable patterns, trends, or distinctions. So for all of us who work in higher education, do any of you, by adding yes or no in there, do any of you participate in committees that students sit on as well? I see some of you saying no, some of you saying yes. Well, I sit on here at my institution at Lenore Ryan. We have a policy where whenever we have a committee, we try to have faculty, staff, and and at least a couple of students on there. So, and some of these committees are tackling big things. And so, one of the things that students often point out when I talk to them sort of off the air is they'll say, "Gosh, these meetings are so long. They just talk about things forever and ever and ever and ever." Now, some of that is just endemic to education, as you all probably know. But a lot of that is because faculty are deep thinking people. Educators are typically deep thinking people. So they're constantly weighing all of the factors. They're engaged in analysis, they're analyzing all of the factors. Have we considered this? Have we considered that? Have we considered this? I'm sure since we have a pastor on here with us, Pastor Renee, if I can put this into your context, if you all are planning on building a new facility or doing something in the church, you want to make sure that you've considered all of the relevant factors, because the next level here brings you to the judgment, the decision making, the decisions that you're going to make about or based on that analysis. And so here, the transition zone in between analyzing and evaluation says when students can render decisions based on their analysis, this is a summative process in which students can determine courses of action, draw likely conclusions, and or render sound judgments. Evaluation is a natural progression of analysis. Therefore, it follows the analyzing stage. So we talked about this yesterday and how whenever we analyze something, we almost automatically come to a decision. If we're going to again, taking it outside of academics, if we go buy a car, well, what are we going to do? We're going to analyze all the factors involved in the car purchasing process. What kind of car we need? How many people are going to be in the car? Is it going to be a car for work? Is it going to be this? What stage of life am I in? How much money I have? How much, if we're environmentally conscious, how much how it impacts the environment. All of these different things are going to be in our analysis that differ from person to person, and they all weigh different things depending on the person. But yet, those are going to be factored in. And when we feel like we've considered all of those things, then we move to evaluating. And so at this level, students are able to make decisions, draw conclusions, and exercise judgment. Students are able to foresee the implications of decisions, courses, or actions or solutions. And then over here, the metric for this is soundness of decision on or course of action is an indicator of successful study. So how sound is my decision? Consideration of implications of decisions is a gauge of successful studying. So you think about the implications of if we make this decision, what's going to happen? I like to think about Supreme Court here. When I do this with students, sometimes if you have access to it, which you can find, I'm sure, have them listen to the Supreme Court deliberate, or any judge deliberate on something, how they use the law and they're weighing the law and what this means and what the implications of this may be, and what this particular prosecutor or attorney's argument may be, and all these factors they're weighing in before they come to their decision as a deliberative body. And so the important thing again is that to help students understand how they're doing these things in their regular lives, in their everyday lives, and in their academic lives. And so just to finish this process, the learning sufficiency or confirmation or the sense of godliness students get is when students sense that their conclusions are based on thorough analysis, right? You evaluate your decisions. Did we analyze everything? How thorough is our analysis? And when students sense that they have considered all implications. So, for example, let's say students are engaged in PBL, project-based learning, and they're doing a project. Well, at this level, this is an important step in them maybe deciding on a project, deciding on the feasibility of a project. Maybe they're deciding on what stage to take in a project. When they get to that point, they have you can help them point out the analysis. As I mentioned my example with my daughter, how I used a simple example of us leaving the house, how there was an analysis involved in that, and how I made a flawed judgment because I didn't factor all the things into my analysis. So again, I can't go on that too much longer, but I hope you all kind of get a sense of how to use this diagram with students. So if you don't mind, while I switch to our next slide, do you feel like you can use this with your students? Great. I see some yeses in there. So I'm going to roll through these because you can look at this later. But I have some metacognitive learning goals that were created by different educators around the country, actually. And so I can't take credit for these, but I'll put them up on the screen, and you can always go back, since you'll have access to the video feed, to go back and look through this. And these will hopefully be useful as you go back and and scroll through these later. You can get an idea of learning outcomes. So before I go to this slide, let me bring up another document here. Okay, do you all see a document that says 4.1 variables and expressions study guide on your screen? Great. So I work with a local teacher here at Caldwell Community College here, and she was teaching developmental math. And I did a presentation there, and she incorporated this into her class and had some really impressive results with her students. And so here's one of the ways that she used the diagram, and she used some of the other tools that I'll get to later. So they're talking about variables and expression study guide, and she has a goal of the day, and she has three distinct goals. And as you can see, these goals are very much linked to thinking levels. Understand the terms variable and expression. Understand what a variable is with the context of an expression, within the context of an expression, and evaluate the expression when given the replacement value for the variables. And so what she did was she took the diagram and she basically formulated different levels. So she has the remembering level here, just simply having them interact at this level. And this is more of a scaffolding method. And she goes down to asking them the the understanding level here. Why do you replace the variables in an expression? Then the next one, how. When evaluating, how do the symbols in an expression direct your work? And then she gives them a chart so they can go through and navigate their way down. And then the next three levels, compare, evaluate, and create. I don't have time to read those, but again, you'll have them on your screen to go back and visit this. But the point is that here she's using this in math, just like any other subject, and she's organizing the material in a way that students can build their knowledge. This is very important because students tend to, especially struggling students, they tend to have an external locus of control, which simply means that they believe that they just can't do something. I'm just not good at this subject. I can't do this. And they sort of develop a powerlessness. And when we help students generate instant feedback, and we help students be able to know exactly what they're doing in their studying and how to go about making what I call getting small victories in their studying along the way, then we transfer them to an internal locus of control, which means they begin to believe that they can control what they do, how I learn. It's not just left up to my faculty member or my teacher, how they just believe, how they determine whether or not I've learned this stuff sufficiently. So back to the PowerPoint. Basically, what we're doing in all of this diagram work is we're working on transfer of knowledge. And I'll briefly say this statement, then I'll move on because we still have a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time. The research on transfer of knowledge says two things. There's two types of transfer, near and far, and that far transfer is highly, highly unlikely and very difficult, and near transfer is much more likely. So, what are far transfer, and what is far transfer, and what is near transfer? Far transfer is when the skills that we're operating are very different from the skills that we're transferring it to. So, to take it out of academics, it would be, well, most people, to leave it with academics first, most people think of write about transfer in terms of, is what students are learning in developmental classes, does that transfer to the general classes? Is what students are learning in in high school, does that transfer to college? That knowledge transfer, the skills transfer to college? Does college learning and skills transfer to the workplace? So on and so forth. And so that's what transfer is about. And far transfer means that the further away those skills are, it makes it far. So, for example, if let's say I'm a really good roller skater. Well, my roller skating skills may not make me a better driver because those skills are farther away from one another. That's not going to have any impact on one another. However, my roller skating skills may help me be a better skier because those skills are nearer, they're much closer. So the nearer we can make the skills, the more easier and more successfully students will transfer their knowledge. So what I've done with transfer knowledge is flipped it and looked at it in a different way. What I've looked at is in terms of the outcomes that students are reaching when they're studying and the outcomes that their tasks are requiring. And what I realized when I started working with students years ago was that students were feverishly working, but the outcomes that they were reaching were very different from the outcomes that they were expected to reach in their on their tasks. Tasks being identified as tests, projects, papers, whatever it may be, those things that we ask students to do in school. And so they were having a situation where the way in which students would think about material while they're studying was very different from the way that they were being required to think about it on the test or on the task. And so therefore it created this far transfer situation that students could not get their way out of. And so with the diagram, what we're doing is we're helping to create near transfer experiences, which based upon all the research, it will make it more likely for students to transfer that knowledge. So for example, remembering, if students' outcomes they reach, the outcomes that students reach while studying are remembering, and the task is simply asking them to remember. Well, as you can see, that line going across, that's a near transfer situation. Very easy to do. However, as the task outcomes deepen and students continue operating at that memory-based level, that's a little bit farther that they have to travel. Now, when it gets down to where where the area where students struggle is analyzing, that's a much farther road their information has to travel. So basically, what we've been able to do with the diagrams is to be able to help students study here at the analyzing level, so that instead of that being a far transfer, it's a straight across near transfer, or as I like to say, the way that they've thought about the material while they were studying is the same way they're going to have to think about it when they're tested. So we're going to get to some practical things now that we understand that you can do. So you'll hear me say this constantly. Explicitness is the key. Because metacognition is already there operating in students' minds, making it explicit is a huge step in moving students toward better performance. So awareness isn't the I should say awareness is not the end, but it surely is the beginning of students moving along in this continuum. And so there are a few areas we're going to look at briefly: the syllabus, what educators can do, and then the textbooks is one of the last things we're going to look at. So what you see on your screen here is something that I have created, and I'll admit it kind of extends beyond the current research. There's a lot of research on learning outcomes. However, what I've done is combined learning outcomes with tasks with metacognition. I just think it's a more powerful mixture of how students are actually operating and what they actually need, because it calls attention to the task. So, for example, in this first one, it says students will be able to independently and analytically read a variety of literary texts and express their comprehension through various tasks. So, I'm communicating with this student. I'm communicating a lot with students with this one statement. So, I'm saying independently, let me get my little marker out here. So I'm pointing out that, hey, in this class, you're going to have to do some independent reading, which most of you know students aren't accustomed to doing independent reading. They're accustomed to doing reading in class or not reading at all. So I'm making them aware from the onset that there's going to be, in this class, there's going to be required independent reading. And that you're going to have to read on an analytical level. So assume that I have demonstrated or showed students how to use the diagram. Now I'm pointing out specifically to a level of the diagram. Maybe I'll distinguish it from simply recall reading that most students are accustomed to and point out analytical reading to them. You're going to have to do this with a variety of literary text, meaning that you're going to be reading multiple texts. And what am I going to have to do with that information? Well, I'm going to have to express my comprehension through various tasks. And then the teacher or professor could articulate what those tasks might be. It might be classroom discussions, maybe short papers, it may be tests, whatever it may be, but they can communicate that. Let's skip down here since I've already used evaluate. Let's say right here, the third bullet, it says provide meaningful content-focused contributions to class discussions. So I know many of you are aware that students go to class and they don't talk. Well, if you talk to students, many of them have been involved in an environment in high school where their job was to sit down, shut up, and listen for 13 years. So when they come to college and we want them to talk and interact, they really haven't practiced that particular type of learning. So here, again, I'm communicating from the outset, that you're going to have to provide meaningful content-focused contributions. And the reason that's in there is because I want them to know that this isn't just where you just talk all off about things you want to talk about, but you have to relate what you want to talk about back to the content. It has to be meaningful. It has to have some kind of purpose. And then that you're going to contribute to class discussions. So they know that, oh, there's going to be discussions in this class and I'm expected to be a part of it. And I know how I'm supposed to be a part of it. So I'll say this as a side, there's a great book called, I think it's in the book, Teaching Unprepared Students, where they talk about the importance of the first week of class. So if you're going to use these learning outcomes, or if you're working outside of the class and you're working with faculty who use learning outcomes, what I encourage you to do is to ensure that faculty are explicit with these outcomes, that you don't just put them in your syllabus and give them to students, as most faculty members do. The reason you don't do that is because, remember, students don't live in education like we do. You know, we live it, we breathe it, we know it. So to them, a syllabus is just another document, and they mainly look for the test, when the tests are, and when the absences, how many absences they can have, or stuff like that. We have to point out to them, hey, in your syllabus, you have these learning outcomes. And these learning outcomes are useful because this is how I've organized my course around these learning outcomes. And so you can see that there's, 7 or so learning outcomes here. So whatever we're going to talk about in this course are going to relate back to these learning outcomes. So they want to be very explicit with those. Does that make sense? A little feedback from you all? Okay, so the next thing is transfer of knowledge. We're looking at, instead of looking at the learning outcomes, how educators talk about material. The same concept applied that we looked at already, the whole near and far transfer. I see Arlene said, yes, often learning outcomes are buried in the syllabus. Yes, you're exactly right. And so that's a whole nother topic. But yes, Arlene, you're exactly right. And so I work a lot with faculty with helping them develop their learning outcomes and then helping them being able to actually use them effectively in the class. So to this slide, transfer of knowledge. So what happens is students have to understand how educators talk about, oftentimes students don't hear complex uh, topics talked about. Somebody's asking me a question. Sorry. What's the book title mentioned? That book is Teaching Unprepared Student. It's by Kathleen Gabriel. So that's the name of that book, Teaching Unprepared Students by Kathleen Gabriel. It's a short book. It's very interesting. I think you all will like it. So when educators teach, it's helpful to be mindful of the level that you're teaching on. So oftentimes educators fall into sort of a similar process that students fall into, whereby they are so focused on getting through the content because they have so much they have to cover that they just talk about things at a remembering level, meaning that, okay, this is important, and they kind of go through the sequence. But yet when they test students, oftentimes they test them on a much deeper level. And so students often are confused as to Why is it when we talk about things in class, how come that's very different from how we're actually being asked to demonstrate our knowledge on our tasks? And so simply by educators pointing out, talking about the content at different levels, understanding all those different levels of blooms, and then being able to connect that to outcomes makes a big difference in students, because students not only absorb the information that you give them in class in terms of their notes, they also absorb the level of thinking that that information is communicated on. So if we talk about things on an analytical level in class, then when they go back in their own study time and begin to process that information, they're more likely to process that at an analytical level. So that's a very important point. So let me move us ahead here. So again, this is just building on the other thing, that there's sort of a different way of teaching that most people kind of teach and just cover a bunch of concepts and they're not really related. They just kind of go on and on and on and on and covering stuff. And with the diagram and with the stuff we've covered, educators can teach the same things. And this isn't more work, but it's teaching it along with the ways of thinking, which makes understanding it much more much more useful. So I'm quickly switching to textbook navigation, which is a reading comprehension technique that I developed, which has been very useful for students. In fact, if you search online, if you YouTube a conversation about deep learning, you'll see me interacting with three, just so you'll know if you see it, three African American male students about them applying this and other techniques and seeing the big difference it had in their academic performance. So again, a conversation about deep learning. So if you think about a GPS is designed to get us from one place to another. The diagram, the Think Well Learn Well diagram, operates in much the same way. Your GPS, the first thing you do is you enter a destination, and think about, so that destination in your GPS is synonymous to a metacognitive learning goal, because it's going to set out something that your GPS is going to seek to get you to. Your GPS can has hundreds of thousands of roads to choose from. However, it is going to select only the roads that your goal, or that the destination you put in, that are required to get you there. And so that's like our thinking. That's the middle part of the diagram. So when we think about something, content, we can think about it in a variety of ways, but our thinking is a function of the goal that we have in mind, as we've already discussed yesterday. And then finally, at the end, when we get to our destination, our GPS has a little signal that says you've arrived at your destination, and that's the third outcome, the third part of the diagram, the learning outcome. And so all that simply means is that the GPS is acknowledging that, hey, you've reached your destination. In the same way that when students travel with their learning, with their content that they've learned, they get a signal in their mind, a sense of I got itness, that they have reached their destination. So college textbooks, or you can say high school textbooks, but it's in college because I work with primarily college students. Students engage in efferent reading, which means they're trying to oftentimes extract information or take something away from the text. I'm going to go through this quickly because we have about 12 more minutes. Determining the salient information from textbooks is perhaps the most daunting task for college students. In fact, if any of you are part of the Learn Assist listserv, there's been a big conversation about this going on based on an article from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And basically, students have trouble distinguishing the most relevant and important information. So they try to capture everything. Their notes are voluminous. And at the end, as one student says on one of the videos that I have, he says, when you try, he said, you feel like everything's important. So you try to capture everything. And of course, when everything becomes important, nothing is important because we can't retain all of the information. So why are textbooks so challenging? One reason is the volume of information. A couple of other reasons that I've identified that we'll talk about here is textbooks are one of the only resources that require us to alternate our thinking levels throughout reading. And readers, not only what must we alternate our thinking levels, but we must know the conditions under which to apply various thinking levels to respective segments of text. So that sounds very difficult, but I'm going to make it pretty simple for us here soon. So quickly, I use a lot of analogies with students because they don't remember all the technical stuff I get into, but they'll remember the analogies because that's consistent with their experiences. So I like to compare textbook reading and driving. And basically, I'll give you the end of it since I'm gonna, I want to make sure I'm on time here. Is that when we're driving to a familiar place, we get on the road, we're going down the road, and our mind wanders somehow. We may be on the phone, we may be listening to music, we may be doing both, but we're traveling down the road, and somehow when our exit approaches, our mind rather automatically comes alert and all by itself kind of alerts itself to say, oh, here's your exit. You need to turn off here. You need to turn here. And somehow every day on these routine tasks, we make our way home, even though we're not fully alert while we're driving. Well, reading is very similar to that. Students will often read and they see themselves turning the pages, but they have no idea how they're interacting with the material. And so at the end, if you ask students, okay, well, what did you just read? What do you know about what you just read? Oftentimes, they will look at you with the deer in the headlight eyes because they have no idea what they just read, but they're sure that they read it. And so they're flipping through the pages is an acknowledgement that they read the material. And so I began to think years ago, what if we can create mental exits in students' minds similar to when we're driving the exits we see on the road, that their mind would rather automatically come alert to the material that they need to know as they're reading. So even if they're kind of mindlessly going through the book, their mind would say, hey, pay attention to this. This is important. So that's what we're going to look at. That's what this textbook navigation is about. So there are two types of destinations that students are going to reach when studying. There are what's called global destinations. These are the overarching course or subject or chapter learning outcomes. These are the big ideas. And then you have the local destinations. And these are the immediate learning outcomes that lead to the global destinations. So the local destinations lead to the global. The goal of the textbook navigation technique is to anchor students' knowledge with the global destinations, usually in the pre-reading phase, and then to allow the local destinations to serve as the more immediate comprehension guides. In the end, students will have knowledge of the local destinations and an understanding of their relationship to their respective global destinations. Now, I know that's a lot of words and it'll make sense here shortly. So in a book, you have, as you can see at the top here, global destinations indicated with the globe, and then you have local destinations indicated with the house. I'm going to skip this part here. And so think if you're taking a trip to Disney World. Now, Disney World is our global destination. That's where we want to end up. However, to get there, there are all these local roads along the way that we have to navigate in order to get to the global destination. Now, here's the kicker. These local destinations are important in themselves, because they're roads that are going to get us there. However, their ultimate purpose is to drive us to this global destination. Well, in the same way, when students read text, they usually pick up all of the local destinations, the smaller, important but less important information, and yet they rarely ever allow these local destinations to lead them to the global destinations in their book, the big ideas. And so they don't really fully understand or grasp the material. So here's a basic chemistry book. Typically, students are going to start reading here, and they're going to pick up on these things that I've highlighted. The bold print typically is what students pick up on if you look at their notes. And if they're given a test in memory-based information, because they're naturally going to try to memorize, well, they'll do pretty well. What I show students is there are these things in their book that many students don't know that are called learning outcomes. And you'll notice that the language with the learning outcomes is very similar to the language on the right side of the Think Well, Learn Well diagram, or on the left side of the learning sufficiency diagram. So learning outcomes, it says, after reading this section, you should be able to, and it lists 10 different things that they should be able to do. Now, if you're working with students, here's exactly how you want to do it. If you were a student, what I'd say is, let's say you're Dan from our starting yesterday. So Dan, Right now, what you're doing is you're trying to memorize all of this information throughout the book. And I bet if I looked at your notes, Dan, you probably have 30 or 40 or 50 different terms or things that you've written down or highlighted in your book or written down in your notes. And that's one way to study. However, you're going to have a lot of information, and this is just one chapter, right? You're probably going to have 3 to 4 or 5 chapters. So just think you're going to have to do that process for the entire 3 or 4 chapters, which means if you have 50 items now, if you have 3 chapters, you're going to have 150 distinct items you're going to have to try to know. That's pretty difficult. The author of the book has given you a tool and said, here are the 10 important global destinations that you need to get out of this book. Now, point out a couple things to you, Dan. You'll see here the first one says define matter, mass, and weight. Well, look at the relationship of this global destination to this local information. The first section in this chapter is matter, mass, and weight. So the author is telling you that all you have to do here is define matter, mass, and weight. So that's the first thinking level. You'll get that. So let's move over now to the next section, elements in an atom. You'll notice now the author is telling you to distinguish between an element and an atom. Now that's 4 levels down on the diagram. So you have to change your level of thinking when you're reading this part of text, because naturally you're going to try to just memorize the definition of elements, definition of atoms, and you'll miss out on what the author has intended for you to get out of there, which is to distinguish between them. And so think about that, Dan. You will have spent time reading this, but yet you wouldn't have effectively used your time because you wouldn't have got out of this what you need to get out of. And then one other thing that I like to point out to you, Dan, notice all the different thinking levels here embedded by looking at these verbs: define, distinguish, name, define, compare and contrast, explain, predict. All of these are thinking levels that can be calibrated on the diagram. And if you understand that, you'll be a much more efficient reader. Okay, Dan, we're running short on time, so I'm going to move us along. So here's one way you can organize your notes. Before you even start reading, look at these learning outcomes and just write at the top of the page, at the end of reading this segment, I must be able to define matter, mass, and weight. Leave some space, and then under that, write, at the end of reading this segment, I must be able to distinguish between an element and an atom. So you want to do that all the way through, and then while you're reading, you simply do this. Read this section, and say, before you read this section, just put this statement in your mind or say it verbally. And then at the end, before you move to the next section, assess yourself and see whether or not you've achieved this particular destination. If you have achieved those 10 destinations that the author laid out in the front of that book, in the front of your book, then you can know for certain that you have sufficiently learned the material that the author of that book intended you to learn. How is that, Dan? Is that useful to you? I just saved you a lot of time, probably helped you be a little bit more effective. All right. So let me skip this part. So here's some in-class applications in our last few minutes here. So there's a research fact that successful students more accurately judge their knowledge. So how can we apply this in class? One is you can use the outcome variation activity, which we've already discussed. You can use the think, pair, share, and compare activity. Now, for those of you who have the 2013 Think Well, Learn Well diagram booklet, this is in that user guide that you have. So make sure you pull these out, because many of these I'm pulling directly from that user guide. This is on page 14, and it gives you a scenario. It gives you 10 steps sequential that you can go through to do this. If you don't have this, you can go on my website to the resources page and get this. I highly encourage this book. It's a great tool, has a notes page in it, and you can definitely use it with your students or with other educators and those kinds of things. Next one is the task outcome analysis. And all this simply means is this: when you give students back a paper or a test, when you return it, use the diagram to provide feedback about the specific types of outcomes students have demonstrated in their work. Then show students the difference between the outcomes embedded within the types of questions they missed and the ones they got correct. So oftentimes students will just see, oh, I got so many answers wrong, but we can help them go a step further by pointing out, you see, you got these types of questions right. Maybe they were explanations, but the ones that asked you for analyzing, you struggle with. So, for example, many students struggle on questions that ask them to choose the best answer. And the reason is because they're used to answering questions that say choose the correct answer. And there's a big difference between the correct answer and the best answer. The correct answer means what have I stored in my mind to remember from what I studied. The best answer requires students to think on the spot and to be able to decide, oh, what is it that what of these options, what is the best answer? So that's an evaluation thinking that requires an analysis. Modeling, model this type of thinking in class. Open tasks. So this is something I'm going to write about shortly, briefly. I mean, the next few weeks. I don't know if anyone has ever done this, but giving students a sheet of paper or having them write or type in what they know about a particular topic or elements of a domain. Just open. You can pick a topic. Hey, we're going to write about the War of 1812. I want you to write what you know about the War of 1812. And then you can go back and help the student go through, either if you're working outside of class or inside of class with students, and then help them identify the types of outcomes that they normally pick up on, and then help them maybe add other dimensions to the types of outcomes they pick up on. So let's look at some out of class applications because it's already 4 o'clock now, according to my time. So you have the learning outcome analysis, and that is simply where you can look at the types of outcomes that students have reached in their study sections, in their notes, in their book, and you're simply analyzing them. What level of the diagram are your notes on? The listening in technique, and this is in that booklet. The fill in the blank technique, this is in that booklet as well. The scaffolding technique, which is also in the booklet, and then the alignment and assessment technique, which is in this booklet. All of these are designed so if you're working with students outside of class, you can help them put their information in and get the information out. I see some of you have to leave. Other thing is I'm adding these to my website as well. I've created these sticky notes that have been very useful to students, and they're all based upon different thinking levels. And so, for instance, in Angie Rupert's class, who did the lady at Caldwell Community College, whose math assignment we just looked at, she used these in her class to actually encourage students to think deeper. So in the class that I visited, sat in on, she would have students come up to the board and solve problems. And based upon the level of thinking they were engaged in during the problem solving process, she would award them a sticky note. Now that may sound simple, but I watched this class transform, and students, adult students, many of them were actually competing for who could get the most money. And if you watch football, college football, they were doing the Johnny Manziel rate or rubbing your fingers together for money thing right there in class. And I found that very, very rewarding because she found a very creative way to use these with students. And it was actually causing them to pay more attention to how they were interacting in class. And I think I told some of you the other day that she actually had 100% of her developmental math students pass her classes this year. Just had a huge success in her classes. So I'm actually doing another workshop with their entire faculty at the end of this year, towards November, August actually. So final thing. Thank you for giving me a few more minutes. So remember this, even though we've covered a lot, and when you go back, you'll see there's a lot in here that you can still chew on. Remember these 4 stages. This can be done rather quickly. We want to start small. If you're going to introduce this to students, start with one topic, one concept, work their way down the diagram, let them become familiar with it. They're going to start here and we're going to move them, nudge them along toward the stage 4 unconscious competence. That's simply what we're doing, and we're using these different tools and resources as a way of getting them to move there. So on my website, there are many articles on my blog. If you click on the link that says the well, you can find all kinds of articles on there. I know many educators download them and share them with faculty and other listservs and with their students. And so hopefully with you participating in the webinar, you'll be able to use these to your advantage and be able to hopefully build upon what we've talked about here. So I'm going to stop because it's 4:04 according to my clock and ask, are there any questions or any feedback you'd like to provide? Well, if anybody, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you for participating. You all have my email address. Please feel free to contact me. And if you want, I should mention this, if you want a version, if you want a copy of this user guide, this document, it's a actual a booklet. If you go to the article that says on my blog that says 3 things educators can do to move students beyond memory-based learning, if you simply add a comment in there, then I will mail you a free copy of this user's guide. So you'll have all those techniques with you. So again, thank you for your time. I'm going to end the webinar, but if folks want to continue chatting, or if I'll take off the chat feature and we can talk. Thank you. Thank you, Arlene. You like that the student outcomes are becoming student owned. Arlene, do you have a minute to chat afterwards, or are you getting out of here?
I'm wondering if my mic is on. Can you hear me?
I'm surprised. I thought I muted everyone, but I can actually hear you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
I usually
I'm
do.
I'm very
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm very um. Let's see. I think I've got this on. Um, I'm really interested in making this a practical application for our DRE classes, and we've also got students who are below the cutoff to even get into developmental classes, and they're going over to basic skills. But I really want to reach out and get those students, because many of them are very bright. They just are so turned off to learning. So I'm really wanting to learn more.
Well, I can't think of his name. Oh, I can see his picture. He was in my Kellogg group up at Appalachian State when I went through that Kellogg program. He oh he does adult basic education, and so he has used a number of these things with his students. In fact, he had me do a video when I was at Kellogg several years ago, and so I know that this has worked with adults in a in basic education courses.
Hmm. Well, that's terrific. So you have gone to the Kellogg Institute?
Yes, I'm actually a Kellogg fellow now. I do a lot of workshops with Kellogg. In fact, I just was in Baton Rouge with them, and I'll be in. That's how I met the gentleman we're talking to yesterday, and I'll be doing something in Virginia with them on Tuesday. And I do all of the advanced Kellogg and Kellogg workshops now during the summer. So yes, I do a lot with the Kellogg Institute.
That's great. Well, I